Hey, Larry. Larry. You gotta stay next to the podium. Great.
Good morning. I should say good morning and welcome to the story of Holland's first business leaders. Our speaker this morning is Steve Vanderveen, who has been teaching business courses at Hope College since 2004. There, he directed the Center for Leadership from 2007 to 2016. And he also co-created, a leadership minor, consulting, and entrepreneurship programs. Before he came to Hope, Steve was a faculty member at Calvin University, where he taught courses in management and marketing. Before that, he worked as a stockbroker. Steve graduated with a BA in English from Calvin and has an MA from Western Michigan and a PhD from University of Illinois, both in marketing. And Kim wanted me to make sure I said that Kim is his neighbor. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Steve Vanderveen.
Thank you. Thank you. And what I love about that introduction is that it doesn't say anything about history. And business history it's really become my hobby, and which has developed over a few years. When I first moved to Holland in 2005, and discovered Kim was my next door neighbor, which was a great joy. One of my other neighbors was Jim Timmerman, and he was the editor of the Holland Sentinel at the time. We got chatting, and I said, I was kind of interested or wondering if I could write a column in the paper called "The Business Next Door," and then we started to do that. So from about 2005 to 2008, I wrote some columns in the Holland Sentinel, and then I got fired. And then this past summer, I thought, boy, that was a lot of fun. I wonder if the Sentinel would be interested in those stories again. So I contacted the editor of the Sentinel, Sarah, and chatted with her for a while, and a business editor, Cassandra. And they said, yeah. And I was thinking, well, I could maybe do it, every other week. And they said, well, what about, would you be willing to do it every week? And I thought, okay, I do have quite a few stories I've worked on, so I'll give it a try. So I've been doing it every week since last July, and it's been just a blast. I've really, really enjoyed writing. I think it's been a great exercise for me. And I have to say thank you to Bob Swearinga, because he's really the main source. So what I typically do is when I think of somebody that I want to write about, or actually probably get the idea from one of Bob's books or something he's written, I go to Bob's 3-volume set on Holland, Michigan, and look in the index, look the name up in the index, and then, start from there. So Bob's been very, 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 very helpful for me. The other thing that I want to make you aware of is I have a nonprofit called Startup Academy, and I list all the stories. In that on that site. Whoops. And one of the things that I want to do is start a newsletter. And so I'm going to pass a sheet of paper around, and if you are interested in being on that newsletter, it's going to be okay. I don't know how often I'm going to write it, but it's going to be on business history and entrepreneurs. And if you'd like to get that, just put your email address on here. So, all right. So I'll just bring that over here. And if you are, thanks. And if you are on Zoom, you can type in your email address and we'll write it down. Okay, so when Hasp asked me to do this, I was wondering I had a couple of questions as I was thinking about this. Where do I start? Because I want to be able to provide some context that's helpful. And how do I frame this thing up? And I thought it'd be helpful to start in the Netherlands in its golden era. And then I thought it'd be helpful to frame this from the perspective of my relatives. So what did Holland look like from my relatives' point of view is sort of where I'm. So we're going to look at the different business leaders in different eras corresponding to when my relatives showed up. I think it'll prove an interesting way to do it. So we're going to try that. So first of all, the Netherlands. So as you well know, the Dutch Golden Age was 1588 to 1672. And at that time, the things that I think that are relevant here is that there were two corporations that they formed, the Dutch East Indies Company, the Dutch West Indies Company. And they basically had trading relationships all over the world. And, and including New Amsterdam, or what is now New York City, they came here to the U.S. in 1614, which is relevant to our story. And some other interesting facts that I think are relevant is that at that time the Netherlands was the most capitalistic country in the world. It had the first stock exchange, and it was home to the wealthiest city in the world. But unfortunately, it all kind of went downhill after that. In 1672, and there was a war with France and Germany, so they were each battling for in the Netherlands. And from 1673 to about 1695, there was an internal conflict between the people that wanted to have a republican form of government and the people that wanted a monarch. And in 1795, the French troops invaded the Netherlands, and William V, who was the monarch at the time, fled to England. And then in 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte's brother became the monarch in the Netherlands. And then in 1815, when Napoleon lost his power, William I came and became the monarch of the Netherlands. So, and when he became the monarch of the Netherlands, he changed the relationship of the church and the state, which is relevant to our story. So one of the things that was also happening at this time was the Enlightenment, this dependence on science. And interestingly, I'm reading a book right now by Paul de Kruijff, who was a famous Zeeland, Michigan author. And the book is about microbe hunters. And it's telling the story of how we discovered different viruses. And this was all happening at this time. And it was obviously raising huge questions with the church. What do we do with this idea of dependence on science as opposed to dependence on God? And that also is relevant to our story. So one of the things that happened was the relationship between the church and the state. Originally, the church in the Netherlands was more separate from the state, and they claimed their dependence on God's word. And then when William I became the monarch, he said he elevated the role of the church relative to the Bible. And the people that had, this was also the time. So there was the Enlightenment going on, and there was also the Calvinist Reformation going on. And those things were, there was conflict over that. So into this comes some of the people that are more relevant to Holland. So there was a teacher named Bilderdijk at the University of Leiden, and he inspired a couple of other people, Isaac da Costa, Groen Prinsterin. And da Costa wrote a book called Grievances Against the Spirit of the Age, which was blasting the Enlightenment. And then Princeton founds the Anti-Revolutionary Party, which advocates for Christian education in schools. So this was an issue back in the early 1800s. In 1829, Schulte, Brummelkamp, Meersburg, Van Velzen, Van Walty, so Albertus Van Walty meet at the University of Leiden. And one of the other conflicts at that time was the singing of psalms versus hymns. The state church said, change the ratio. You got to sing like three hymns for every psalm or something. And the Calvinists, they only wanted to sing psalms, right? So there were these conflicts, and as a result of these conflicts, Henrik de Kock's church gets suspended. He's preaching in Groningen. He gets suspended. Schulte's church gets sanctioned. Vandalized. Johannes Vandalister, Jan Stegety, they get fined in Zeeland because they're holding churches. They're holding churches illegally in their bar in Vandalister's barn, and Stegety is one of the elders in that church. So there's a lot of stuff going on now. I know there's a genealogist in the room. And I don't know enough about my family's genealogy, so I'm confessing here that this is where I have to do homework. But I want to talk a little bit about Hendrik Schulte for a second. He was born in Amsterdam. His father operated a sugar refinery. And when he was 23, his grandfather, father, and mother passed away or had passed away. So he decided that he didn't want to run the business. So he sold the business and went to the University of Leiden. Where he obtained a theology degree. And he married somebody named Sarah Maria Brandt. You're going to find out later that Brandt is one of my ancestors. So I don't know how they're connected or if they're connected, but that's one of the things that I want to find out. Sarah died, and he remarried, and eventually he immigrated to the U.S. and he immigrated to Iowa. So Pella, Iowa is the city that he founded, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But it's interesting that he was very wealthy, and he took a steamship across, and his followers took sailing ships. So that's just kind of an interesting tidbit there. All right, so we know more about Albertus Van Walty. So he was born in 1811. He joined a Seceder church in 1836. And that's interesting because his father was a pastor of one of the state churches. So he left the church his father was a pastor of and joined one of these radical churches that was being fined by the state. And he was a very entrepreneurial person. He wanted to do things to help his parishioners because they were, as I was saying, that things were kind of going downhill economically in the Netherlands. And he wanted to find jobs for his parishioners. So he and his wife came from a wealthy family. So he invested in clay factories to create jobs. He bought a soap manufacturer. And then eventually he left, in 1846 with followers to America. So again, this is a map, and it shows where Van Walty was born. It shows Amsterdam, where Schulte was born, and it shows Leiden, which is just to the southwest of Amsterdam, where they met at the university. And I wanted to show some maps because what's so interesting to me is that the people that came from the Netherlands to America and into Holland came from all different parts of the Netherlands. They didn't all come from the same part. They came from all different places, which I find just very interesting. So Groningen, up in the north, there is where de Kock was suspended. Again, different part of the Netherlands. So these seceder churches were all over the place. North Brabant, Netherlands, so more in the south is where Schulte ministered. He also ministered in Utrecht, and so the people were leaving for religious and economic reasons. And so where are they going to go? Well, America was the place they were thinking about going because there were already Dutch settlers here. Basically, they were looking at all the places there were Dutch settlers, right? From back when Holland, the Netherlands was in its golden era. So they were looking at the Dutch East Indies, they were looking at the Cape of Good Hope, and they were looking at America. And relative to our story, Schulte was looking at Iowa, and Van Raalte was trying to decide whether to go to the east or west shore of Lake Michigan. And what's also, to me, very interesting is that Van Raalte didn't decide until they were almost here. That's so. Imagine going on a trip when your leader doesn't know where you're going, doesn't know the destination, and that's really interesting to me. Okay, so from an economic point of view, in America, there was a surplus of land and a scarcity of labor, but in the Netherlands, there was a shortage of land and a surplus of labor. So one of the attractions of America was you could own you could own property. And as we're going to see here, wealth owning property is one of the ways people become wealthy. But there's a problem in America. America wanted people to immigrate, wanted Europeans to immigrate to this country, but there's a problem. The Native Americans were inhabiting the lands. So this is the time of Andrew Jackson. So 1829, 1837. And so one of the things Jackson is known for is clearing the land. So there were some treaties which basically involved removal of the Indians. Now, the Indians could stay, the Native Americans could stay, but they had to become like Americans. They had to go to school. They had to become farmers. They had to basically change their culture, which we'll see was not something they wanted to do. Again, wealth was generated through real estate investments. So coming to America was attractive to a lot of people, and they were being encouraged by railroad companies and steamship companies because that was what was happening. The railroad was the technology at the time. There's a famous book called How to Make a Living on a Farm in Kansas. And then in West Michigan, we had what we think of as paper cities. We had Port Sheldon and Superior. We're going to talk a little bit more about Superior, but I want to mention Port Sheldon for a second. So I interviewed Evelyn van Dorp, who's from Zeeland. I interviewed her in 2005. And she had some amazing stories, which I haven't been able to verify. But she claims that her ancestors lived for a while at a hotel in Port Sheldon, and that hotel in Port Sheldon was built by money that came from Mr. Biddle, Nicholas Biddle. Now, Nicholas Biddle was a very wealthy banker. He was the president of the Second National Bank of the United States. And I don't know if you know much banking history, but this is back in the era when there were state banks and we were just getting national banks. So if you can imagine back then, every state had numerous banks, and every bank had its own currency, right? So if you lived in Pennsylvania and you lived in Philadelphia, you might have a bank there. But if you went to New York and you wanted to do business, you had banknotes from Philadelphia, and they were only accepting banknotes from the bank in New York. So it's very difficult to do business, and banks would be trading currency, exchanging state currency, right? So wouldn't it be great to have a national bank where you have one currency? And the federal government was thinking that would be a good idea too, or at least some were, that'd be a good idea because the federal government could do business with a national bank. Well, Andrew Jackson didn't think that was a very good idea. So here we're back to Andrew Jackson. Well, Thomas Biddle was the president of the second bank, National Bank of the United States, and Andrew Jackson basically put them out of business. He didn't want to approve having a national bank, so he put them out of business. But before he put them out of business, Thomas Biddle, apparently, according to Evelyn Van Dorp, invested in Port Sheldon, bought a lot of property there, built a hotel, him and investors, because the idea was, let's buy up all the property, and then when the immigrants come, they'll buy it from us, and we'll make money that way. So that was, that was the story in Port Sheldon. The same thing was happening in Superior. Now, Superior was a little town where Wakazu Woods, where Wakazu Woods is today, where Marigold Lodge is today. Superior was a paper city where Marigold Lodge is today on Black Lake. This map comes from Bob Swearingen and Bill Appledorn's Old Wing Mission. So you can see on the left-hand side, Superior, the little dot by Black Lake, and then on the right hand side, you can see Old Wing Mission, which we'll get into in a minute. But that's where one of the settlements of the Ottawa Indians. So Superior was before Holland. Obviously, there was this city called Superior, which was backed by some investors from Kalamazoo. So in 1835, Representatives Siren Burdick, Elisha Belcher, Caleb Sherman, they formed a Black River Company at Superior. They made two roads, one to Grand Haven, one to Kalamazoo. They built a sawmill, blacksmith shop, schooner, 7 houses. They plotted 600 lots on both sides of the straits, and had a post office, and that's quite relevant to our story. Now, at the same time they were there, of course, the Ottawa Indians were here, and this is just a famous painting about an Indian sugar camp that I wanted to show, just to kind of show what a village might have looked like for the Ottawa Indians who were living in the same spot. So Superior pushed the Ottawa Indians out. The Ottawa Indians would come here in the summer, and they would live on the north side of Black Lake and on the south side of Black Lake. And of course, when Superior came, they were forced out of the north side of the lake. This is showing what a camp, what it might have looked like in this time of the year when they were turning sap into sugar. Okay, so in 1837, Chief Wakazu of the Ottawa Indian meets the Protestant minister George Smith. So as I said, the United States was trying to remove the Indians, but they said they could stay if they would become Christian and learn how to farm. And so there were different societies around that were meant to help the Indians change their way of living. And one of those was a society that was set up by Judge Kellogg in Allegan. And he hired he and some other people hired George Smith. And George Smith met Chief Waukezu in 1837. And Waukezu needed George Smith because Waukezu wanted to buy land, and the government wasn't going to sell land to Indians unless they had a liaison, right? So Waukezu needed Smith so he could buy land. And Smith wanted him to buy land at the Old Wing Mission. So he wanted him to buy land inland and south of, a little bit southeast of Black Lake. He wanted him to buy land there for a couple of reasons. One was he wanted to keep the Indians away from the traders. So there were traders going up and down the coast. They were buying Indian animal skins from the Indians. They were exchanging them for whiskey and other things. And so Smith wanted to protect him from that. He also thought living southeast of town here, that was a good farming area. So he thought that would be a good place for them to live. So Smith and Waukezu connect. They buy some property. And at the time, Smith was living in Allegan with his family. So Smith meets Captain Macy, or first Smith moves from Allegan to Singapore. And as you know, Singapore was another little town that was on the lake shore of Lake Michigan by Saugatuck, right? So they lived in Singapore for a little while. And then in 1839, Captain Macy, who was the person that was responsible for building this town at Superior with the money that was raised from the people in Kalamazoo, he moves them from Singapore to Superior and becomes their landlord and their merchandiser. So Macy has a store at Superior, and Smith is one of his customers. 1839, Waukezu's tribe buys the Old Wing Mission, and Smith and his family move there, and they help each other survive. I thought you'd be interested in this. Maybe you saw this in the Holland Sentinel a few weeks ago. This is a picture of what Singapore looked like on the shores by Saugatuck. And also fascinating to me was they had a bank, and here's some of their currency. So here's what, if you lived in Saugatuck, you probably traded in the currency that looked like this was your dollar. This is what you traded with. All right, so the Smiths have some cash because they're paid, because they're missionaries. The church is paying their salary. They're getting money from the government. Smiths need flour. I was going through Appledorn and Swearinga's book about the Old Wing Mission, and Smith would keep records of what he was buying. So he was buying flour, sugar, pork, butter, tea, vinegar, potatoes, rutabagas, corn, pickles, cranberries, tournaments. That's what he needed. He needed postage because he was always writing his reports. And then Waukezu and Smith would also need medical supplies. So they would get them through Captain Macy at Superior. And then for cash, the Ottawa they would trap, they would turn sap into sugar, or they would hunt and they would pick. And apparently this region was loaded with, because it's so swampy, I guess it was just loaded with cranberries. Cranberries was something that they picked. Well, in 1841, by that time, Macy had died, and Superior was basically a dead city. So the Ottawa are hired to carry lumber, shingles, nails, glass, and other building supplies from Superior to Old Wing Mission. So Smith hires the Ottawa to go to the Superior and take the building materials and move them all to Old Wing Mission to build a school and buildings. And interesting, about that same time, a Catholic missionary Bisacki, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, he visits the Indians at the landing. So now what's happening here is that you have the town of Superior, which is now of ghost town. You have Old Wing Mission, which is southeast of Black Lake. And the Indians help move materials from Superior to Old Wing Mission. And in exchange for that, they get land by the landing. Now the landing, if I can go back to my other map here, the landing is on the other side of Black Lake from Superior, where Hines is today. Okay. So they get land at the landing for doing this work. And because the rationale is Judge Kellogg, who of Allegan owned the land, he sold them the land, and the rationale was, well, it makes it easier for them to transport things because they're by water, and it's easier for them to have a place where they hunt, where they fish, and so on. So they have this land there. Then what happens is a Catholic missionary comes and visits them at the landing. Now what we have is a Catholic mission at the landing and a Protestant one at Old Wing Mission. So there was conflict in the tribe, and they have dual loyalties. And at the same time, another chief, Makasabi, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, he's a Potawatomi chief, and he joins them at the landing. And he doesn't like Captain Smith, or doesn't like Protestant missionary Smith, who's at Old Wing Mission. So you have Chief Wakazoo, who likes Protestant missionary Smith, and you have Chief Makasabi at the landing who likes the Catholic missionary. So you have these dual loyalties. And also what's happening here is Wakazoo is saying, we don't like farming. Smith, you're trying to teach us how to farm. We don't like farming. When we farm, it feels like we're slave to the animals because we have to always be here when the animals want to eat, right? We got to take care of them. We're not free anymore. So, things aren't going great. Anyway, so in 1844, according to Smith's diary, the Indians, they shipped 6 canoes full of cranberries to Kalamazoo and St. Joseph, and they purchased flour. So this is how they were getting the supplies that they need. In 1845, they produced 15,000 pounds of maple sugar, which generated about 75% of the value of their annuity payment. So again, when the Indians agreed to stay and to become Americanized, let's say, the government said, we'll give you an annuity. We'll give you a stipend, right, to help you. So they would get the government stipend, and they would also generate extra money with selling cranberries and animal skins and so on. All right, so Chief Wakazoo dies in 1845 as Peter Wakazoo, his younger brother, succeeds him, and the tribe again retains these dual loyalties. All right, so now that's what's happening in Holland. And then back in the Netherlands, in 1846, two men, Hartgering and Arnold, leave for America because Admiralty sends them to America to talk to the people in New York. And then in 1846, man from New York, DeWitt, travels to the Netherlands. And then in 1846, Admiralty and his followers decide to leave, and they arrive in New York in November. And again, they make a decision on West Michigan on their way, once they've reached America. In fact, once they've got to New York, they've got to Buffalo, and it's kind of between Buffalo and Detroit that they decide that they're going to go to West Michigan. Why did Admiralty choose West Michigan as opposed to Wisconsin? Well, he saw the forests as a source of income for the colony. So this is very different from Schulte. Remember, Schulte went to Pella, Iowa. Schulte wanted to farm, and he thought the forests were going to get in the way of that. So he wanted to go to Iowa. Admiralty saw the forest as an asset, thought that would be a good source of income. even though it would be a hindrance to farming. Thought the soil was good. He liked the fact they were near two rivers. He thought it would be good for growing fruit. The lake would be protecting them. He thought he'd be left alone, which is really interesting because no sooner does he get here that he invites other Yankees to come and help him. So he's not left alone anymore. And he thought there was more variety for the economy. Okay, so 1846, all this stuff's happening. Van Raalte travels from New York to Buffalo to Detroit. He leaves his group in Kalamazoo and Allegan, and he comes out here to the Old Wing Mission and meets Smith. So George Harrington brings him from Judge Kellogg and Allegan to the Old Wing Mission. Meantime, a guy named Keppel and Fansteel and Vanderhaar, three young men at the time, arrived in St. Louis. So they were initially going to go with Schulte. And Schulte had his mind set on Pella, Iowa. So something happened to Keppel, Fansteel, and Vanderhaar when they were in St. Louis waiting to meet up with Schulte. Schulte was going to get to St. Louis and then go up to Iowa. Something happened, and they decided they were going to go to Holland. They were going to go visit. They were going to meet with Van Raalte. So they ended up coming via Chicago to the landing. They ended up at the landing. So Van Raalte was at the Old Wing Mission with his followers eventually, and these three ended up at the landing on the south side of Black Lake, right? So they were coming then. Then we had a whole bunch of other people coming: Rabbers, Ipma, Vandeleister, Stegedy, Vandermeulen, Den Herder, Wabeek. They were coming by way of Buffalo via steamship. So you had Van Raalte came from Buffalo to Detroit, across the land to Allegan, Kalamazoo, Holland. Keppel, Vanderhaar, Fansteel came via St. Louis and up through Chicago, and then Vanderleister, Rabbers, Ipma, Stegedy. These folks came by way of Buffalo, but they came by steamship around the lake. It's very interesting. They came from a steamship to Grand Haven, and then Grand Haven, they got dropped off on what is today Ottawa Beach. That's where they got dropped off. Some of them even walked, apparently, from Grand Haven to Ottawa Beach. And they ended up staying their first night in shelters on Ottawa Beach, like made out of driftwood. And then they came to town. So let me skip ahead here just for a couple of their, just talk a little bit about, their account. So this is the account of the Zealanders. In June, the steamship drops the Dutch off via smaller boats. The Dutch see Ottawa on canoes. One Dutchman pulls a sword out of his trunk and waves it. The Dutch sleep on beach under the stars. The group arrives in Holland the next day, expecting cleared land and seeing dense forests. Is this Holland? In this Holland, I guess the question was. They get soaked in rain. Some get sick and died. Cooked bread on iron pan. They laid in the ashes. Next day, a scow arrives with vegetables. They make beans and soup. They lodge in three wooden sheds, one on River Avenue, two on 8th Street. After dislodging another group that had arrived the previous night, and then they moved to this Hetwater House, this little shack that's on the branch of the Black River in present day, or used to be the Country Club golf course. And then they cut their way to the Zealand Hill. So that's one account. And here's another account from from Jan Stegedy's son. We had come from Buffalo by propeller steamer, and we were in peril all the time because of the danger from fire. They kept some of us boys continually on the upper deck, pouring water around the smokestack so the boat wouldn't catch on fire. We came around by water from Detroit to Mackinac and down Lake Michigan, going first to Chicago. We remained but a short time on the lakeshore, just enough to secure lumber from Saugatuck. With this, we made great rafts and carried our party and belongings up Black Lake to the site of Holland City. My father and us boys, together with other men of the party, went on to the site of present village of Zealand, and here, with the assistance of Indians, we managed to get up our cabin. So kind of a different perspective on the Indians as well. So I'm going to watch my time here. So one of the characters that I want to talk about was Martin Ipma. He was born in the Friesland in the Netherlands. And in 1835, he was a barge skipper and a trader in potatoes. In 1836, he was interrogated by the Dutch burgomaster regarding unauthorized religious gatherings. In 1845, he becomes a minister. 1846, he's asked to lead a group of immigrants to America. And that's just where it intersects with my story. So apparently, one of the people in that group was the aunt of my great-great-grandmother. He chooses Friesland because of its fertile clay soil, and he ends up serving all these churches, which were all little burgs. So Friesland, Grascup, South Holland, Illinois, Roseland, Illinois, which is in the south side of Chicago, and then he also goes to Wisconsin. Okay. All right, I want to show what Holland looked like in the 1870s. So I'm going to skip ahead here. So these are my relatives to Brants. They immigrate to Holland in 1867 from Zeeland, the province of Zeeland, which is on the southwest side of the Netherlands. They go by boat up the Hudson River to Albany, by boat on the Erie Canal to Buffalo, and then by rail to Detroit and Grand Haven, then by steamship from Grand Haven to Holland, arriving just before Christmas. They stay with her aunt, who had moved to Holland from Friesland. Marina's got a job cutting wood, then building a roadbed and sawing firewood for the Allegan Grand Haven Railroad. They joined the True Dutch Reformed Church, which became the Christian Reformed Church. And this is a picture of them later in life. And this is what I wanted to get to. This is Holland in the 1870s, just 1870, just before the Great Holland Fire. Now, this is a picture. You're looking at River Street looking north. 8th Street is going east and west. You can see all the buildings are made out of wood. Sidewalk is made out of wood. And I don't know if you can read the picture there, but the reading down on the right, Vanderveen. Okay, so on the right-hand side, where JB and Me is today, was Vanderveen Hardware. And again, to my knowledge, no relation to me, but again, I have to do the genealogy to find out. And then across the street, where Model Drugstore is today, was where Henry and Anna Post had a store. And then behind Henry and Anna Post store, so going north, where I guess the parking lot is, was Ailing's Brewery. And then going north where maybe 6th Street and River is, there was a mill, Workman and Gehring's flour mill. And then on the left-hand side, so where Reader's World is today, there was Fansteel's residence. And on the other side, where the clock tower is today, was the City Hotel, which is what Fansteel owned. So that's what it looked like at 1870 to my relatives. So Vanderveen, interesting guy. He rides in Holland with his parents. He opens a hardware store where JB&B is today. Or Jacob opens a hardware store when JB&B is today. When Jacob dies in 1849, Ingbertus takes over. And one of the great stories about Ingbertus is that he built the rooster on top of Pillar Church. So in 1855, Pillar Church asked Ingbertus to build a tin roof for the church steeple, as well as a large copper rooster to adorn the steeple and turn with the wind. He couldn't figure out how to do it, but he determines a wine bottle would be the appropriate pivot. So something like 60 years, the pivot for the rooster was on the top of the church was a wine bottle, which again is very interesting because the temperance movement was very strong in Holland. So after that. Here's an ad from the 1873 Holland City News for Vanderveen's hardware store. You can see selling stovepipe, stove furniture, horse nails, house nails, I can't tell, horseshoes, horse nails and horseshoes, wagon springs, horse trimmings, farm implements, carpenter's tools. You know, the 1870s, 1880s, this was the Gilded Age. And this is when there was very, very robust economic expansion. Here's a picture of his hardware store after the Great Holland Fire. So this is, again, JB and me today, but it was obviously made out of, you know, after the Great Fire in 1871, they rebuilt and built brick. All right, Henry Post. So this is one of the people Van Raalte recruited to come to Holland to teach the Dutch how to do business. So Henry and Anna immigrated from Vermont to Allegan, then to Holland in 1848. Post and Van Raalte go into the potash, soap, and baking soda business. They build a factory at the mouth of Black Lake and sell their goods in Chicago. And the Post opened a general store, which is that store where Model Drug is today. Henry becomes the Holland's first postmaster, township supervisor, attorney, justice of the peace, notary public, and tax agent. So he wore a lot of hats. He discovered stone, the Waverly Stone Company. So Waverly Stone is in a lot of buildings in downtown Holland, the Tower Clock Building, Graves Hall at Hope College, a number of other buildings. They discovered stone in a pit, in a mine, just on the north side of north side of M21 and Waverly Road. That northwest corner, there's a stone mine in there. In 1851, Post, Van Raalte, and Dimbleker of Kalamazoo built a saw and grist mill near present-day Van Raalte Farm. The mill goes bankrupt. In 1857, he purchases a ship for his business. And then in 1867, they sell Waverly Stone to John Roost. Now, somebody asked me today, wouldn't it be cool? I think you asked me today, wouldn't it be cool? I'd love to know what's behind the names of some of the streets in town. And there's a street on the north side of Black River, directly across from where Windmill Island is. There's a Roost Street. And I'm guessing that Roost had orchards in that area. And I think he lost a lot of those with the Great Holland Fire, because the Great Holland Fire moved from the southwest to the northeast. And I think the flames and the ashes ended up on his property and destroyed his orchards and stuff. John's a very interesting character, which he was a very ardent Republican and was the editor of the Grandwet, which is a Republican newspaper. And then late in his life, he became a Democrat. So interesting story. Okay, so back to that picture. Behind Model Drug, there was a brewery. John Ayling started a brewery. Initially, Van Raalte prohibited the sale of alcohol in the colony. Later, the Colony Council relented and decided that druggists could sell alcohol during the sickly season for medicinal purposes only. And then gradually, they started allowing the sale of beer. And this is a whole nother story, but it was a very, very touchy subject because the temperance movement was very big in the late 1800s. And early 1900s. And so it seems like every year there was a vote on whether they were going to allow beer to be sold at taverns in town. So one year they could, one year they couldn't. Then they decided to raise fees and so on. It was just ongoing battle. But anyway, Ayling had the first brewery in town, and he made about 450 barrels a year. And that brewery was lost in the Great Holland Fire in 1871. After that fire, Anton Seif and some other folks built a brewery on the corner of 10th Street and Pine, 10th and Pine on the north east corner. And that brewery lasted for quite a while. Okay, so there's another character at this time, Aldert Pluger, and he had a shipping business and carried commodities between Holland and Chicago. These are vital for Holland. I mean, they didn't have much money, but they didn't have a lot of things. They didn't have things to live on either. They needed farm commodities. They weren't growing enough of them in the early days. And so these shippers were very crucial to the economy. 1853, he employs 14 men to build ships. In 1856, he purchases 2/3 interest in the flour and lumber mill of White Vine and Company. So that's again on the corner of 6th and River. And he became a very wealthy man. But you can see what's happening. So they come to Holland, it's all forests. They got to clear land so they can farm. Once they do that, they start growing wheat and oats and things. And then they need to have a mill, right? So the entrepreneurs, first they build ships to get product back and forth to Holland. They sell lumber products and take back food products. Then they start building their own mills and things to process farm products. And Aldert Pluger was one of those people. He hosted the first Bank of Holland in his parlor. So his house was on 5 East A Street, which is where the Warm Friend is today. And then he dies in 1860, and another wealthy Hollander, Jacob Van Putten, buys mill and rename it City Mills. And that's what we see in this picture, City Mill, way in the background there, in the center of the picture. Here's a picture of Pluger's early mill, the one before the one you see in the photograph. All right, Fan Steel, he owned a shoe store in New York, and Van Raalte recruited him to come to Holland, encouraging him to open a store, a mill, or a stagecoach service. But he comes here and he opens the first tannery, and his employee is Isaac Capon. So Isaac Capon learned the tannery business from Peter Fansteel. But in 1851, he sells the interest in his tannery and opens a general store and invests in a schooner and a stagecoach to carry mail. In this general store, he sells butter, leather goods, mirrors, shears, shoes, and thread. And then in 1867, he opens the City Hotel. He also owns a mill, which helped him build rental property. So apparently he was the most wealthy person in Holland, or one of the most wealthy people in Holland, before the Great Holland Fire. So he lost a lot in the Holland Fire. Van Putten purchased present-day Waukezu Woods and lumbers trees at his mill near Maple and A Street. So in 1860, he and E.J. Harrington, another partner, started a steam-powered passenger shipping service. He also buys an interest in Pluger's mill. And then in 1878, he partners with Nathan Kenyon and opens a bank in downtown Holland, where Friss is today. So you can see that the economy in Holland is starting to develop, and you have different types of businesses, mills and shipping, grocery stores or general stores, and now you see the financial industry banking. Here's an ad for Jacob Van Putten from the 1879 Holland City News. Does a general banking exchange and collection business. Collections made on all points in the United States and Europe, particular attention paid to the collection of banks and bankers, remittances made on the day of payment. All business interested to me shall have prompt attention. Interest allowed on time deposits, subject to check at site. I can't read that. Foreign exchange bought and sold tickets to and from all points in Europe. So he's a bank, but he's also a travel agent, right? So, and that seemed to be pretty common among early banks. E.J. Harrington, he's born in 1832. He's son of George Harrington, who's the one who brought Van Raalte to the Old Wing Mission. E.J. can read Dutch and English, likely because his mother was of Dutch descent. His father was not. And so he serves as an interpreter. He's a logger, which a lot of people were as their first job. He purchases with the money 240 acres of land. He opens a store near the corner of A Street and College. And he heavily invests in real estate in the Holland area, but especially toward the lake. So if you drive down South Shore Drive, you run into a street called Harrington, and that's named after Mr. George or E.J. Harrington. He had a big dock over there, which is near the South Shore Marina, I think it's called. And he also buys a schooner to transport stuff. Here's an ad for his store from the Holland City News in 1872. Looks like he's selling building supplies, and he wants oak staves for barrels and hemlock bark, which he then is shipping probably to Chicago. Heber Walsh, the Walshes immigrate to Holland in 1847. They come from New York. Heber opens a general store at 2527 East A Street, where the outpost is today. In 1859, Heber hires a firm from Wisconsin to build him a shipping dock. In 1868, they co-found Grace Episcopal Church. In 1870, Heber obtains permission from the city to build a wooden sidewalk in front of his store. So he was the first one to have a wooden sidewalk, I think, which was a great invention. And then, of course, as many druggists did in those days, they sold patent medicines. In addition to liquor for medicinal purposes. And here's an ad from the 1870 Holland City News for his drugstore. I love old ads because they're all words. There's no pictures. Here's a picture of his drugstore. It's again a wooden structure. John Coatworth is born in Quebec. He moves to Mason, Michigan, where he's a carpenter, then a partner in a mill, and a hardware store and a bank. He marries Lavina Abbott from 1840 to 1844. He serves various positions there in Mason. In 1863, he asked John Klein to design his house. He asked Grotius van Dark to build it. He moves to Holland in 1865 and starts a fruit farm. So he lives in the city, but has a fruit farm north of the city somewhere. I don't know where. Then he marries another lady. He must have divorced his first wife. Which must have been quite a controversy back in those days. And in 1874, is one of the largest peach shippers in Holland. In 1880, he sold his house to Garrett and Mary Van Raalte Collin. This is the house. So right across the street from the Capon house is the Coatsworth house, which somebody has redone. Current owners, I would love to see the inside of that house. Well, that's where that house came from. All right, we know more about Isaac Capon, who lived across the street. He was born in the Netherlands, 1830. He pays for his passage as a cook's helper. He was part of Vanderleister's group, but he ended up staying in Rochester, New York, because he had relatives there. But his father and uncle died of cholera. And so he came to Holland, and he starts working for Peter Fansteel. Then he works for a tanner in Grand Haven, then another one in Grand Rapids, and he meets John Birch. And in 1849, he buys land from the Ottawa at the foot of Washington and A Street, where he and Birch start a factory and a tannery. And he was greatly helped by the Civil War because he secured a government contract for shoe and harness leather. So that really gave him a boost. And then in 1866, they opened an office in Grand Rapids. In 1867, he is the Holland's first mayor. So Holland was moved from that time from a kind of a town run by Van Raalte to a town with a government structure, and then Capon becomes the first first mayor. He co-founds Third Reformed Church, which he's a Sunday school superintendent. Interesting, later in life, his first wife passes away, and he marries, when he's 60 years old, he marries a 20-year-old. And that offended people at the Third Reformed Church, so they asked him to step down from being the Sunday school superintendent. All right, Tunis Keppel, so he's one of the three guys that came to Holland via St. Louis. He was originally part of Scholte's group. He's born in South Holland, the Netherlands. He arrives by the way of the landing, which is that property by Heinz. And he marries Gertrude Bloomers. The ceremony is performed with royalty. Their oldest daughter, Jane, is born in 1849. And here's an interesting factoid. She was one of 2 infants out of 22 who were born in that colony and survived. So survival rate was not good when they first came to the region. After the fire in 1871, they built a brick home. Now, this house, I'm pretty sure was their brick home. It was just recently torn down and replaced by the Home Realty Building, which is on the corner of College and 7th Street. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that, so I did get I'm pretty sure that was their brick, the brick house they built after the Great Fire. Here's a picture of the Capon and Birch Leather Company early on. Interesting, you can see how swampy the land is there. And this is, should have said, this is where the land that's kind of between where the Civic Center is today and the vacant lot that's next to Boatworks. That was kind of where the property was. Okay, so I'm going to go switch to Friesland here. So on my mother's, well, I'm going to leave some time for questions. So let me scoot here and see how much I can talk. Let me talk about Holland here. Okay, I'm going to scoot. I'm going to stop with Friesland for a sec because I want to show you Holland in the 1880s. Okay, so on my dad's side, my great-grandfather, Roelof van der Veen, wanted to come to America, but his parents didn't want him to come here. And so he came to New York and he saw how busy it was and chaotic, and it scared him. So we basically got on the boat and went back home. So he was not an entrepreneur. Sometimes I get the question, why was Holland so entrepreneurial? Well, basically, if you're willing to leave your country and come to a place, and they didn't even know what place you were going to, and just for the opportunity to live a new place and build a new home and buy some land and then, farm or start a business. I mean, if you're willing to leave your country and everything you knew to move here where there was nothing and you except a dream, you're pretty entrepreneurial. Right. My great-great-grandfather was not entrepreneurial. His family was not. I mean, he was scared. He didn't want to, his family was very afraid of this country. So he got on a boat and came here and turned right around and went back home. He was very, very afraid. But if he had been here, what would he have seen? All right. Well, here we got the Chicago and West Michigan Railway at Lincoln and 9th Street Depot. So there was the railway had come to Holland by 1880. Van Putten's son, Jacob Van Putten's son, Black Jake, had a wooden butter tub factory business in Montague, and they relocated to River Avenue and 4th Street. The wood staves for making the butter tubs and other containers came from Black Jake's sawmill in New Richmond. So he was a very entrepreneurial person. One of the plant supervisors was James DeYoung, and I had to throw that in there because we have the James DeYoung power plant, which is dismantled. But that's where James DeYoung surfaced. He worked in this butter tub factory. Here's a picture of the factory, River and 4th Street. That's what my Roelof would have seen had he been here. he would have seen an incredible building business going on with James Huntley. James Huntley was born in England in 1845. His father was a master builder. He immigrates to Holland in 1871, which was just when the Holland fire happened. So he ends up building, so as you can see, so many buildings in Holland. And Macatawa Park and Ottawa Beach. So a lot of this was all happening after the fire. An incredibly productive builder. This is one of the buildings that he built, the First State Bank, which was on the corner where of Central and A Street, where the new restaurant, what's the restaurant? Yes, the Blueberry restaurant, Barman's is there. That's what's there now. But there used to be this 4-story or 3-story building, which was something that he built. Here he built the West Michigan Furniture Factory, which is located where Padness is today. In fact, there's the office. There's an office building of Padness that's part of this complex. So I have to say that Capon's factory kind of moved a little bit around the corner to where the Civic Center is, and then they moved across the river as well to where the Michigan State Bio whatever facility is. They also had land there. Another crazy guy in the 1880s was Reinhard Workman. He immigrates to Holland and is with his family in 1867. His father dies when he's 12. As a teenager, he works at the Heed planing mill, which was where the post office or Holland Museum is today. He buys the business after borrowing money from his pastor. He pays back his pastor by somehow buying a sawmill north of Holland, and then when the wood's delivered, he gets the money from that and he pays back his pastor. So he was I don't know, when I was a kid, we called people, because we had the term wheeler dealer. He was a wheeler dealer. In 1879, he goes to Kansas and Nebraska. When he returns, he and Gradus Van Ark purchased the Phoenix planing mill out of bankruptcy. And then he has these great dreams. He's going to build this agricultural works. He gets which is here again on off of River Avenue and down by the river. And here's his planing mill, which was 10th and which is again 10th and River. Here's an ad from that, and the rest of the story is he ends up overextended, and there's a problem. He wanted to borrow money to bail himself out from an insurance company in Grand Rapids, and they said there was a problem with his title, so they wouldn't lend him the money, and his whole empire collapsed. So then he left town and went to South Haven, tried to build another factory. That collapsed, and then he moved out west, and he worked for the railroad, and he sold real estate on Whigby Island to Dutch people. So that's anyway. Here's an ad from this mill. Cornelius Blom was a really interesting character. He's born in 1844. I told you that temperance alcohol was a big issue in Holland. In 1883, so if my ancestor would have come here, he would have seen the Rosebud Saloon at 15 River Avenue. So Mr. Blom has a saloon, and he also serves as a city constable, which I find really interesting combination. His son opens a confectionery on A Street where he serves milkshakes. And then funny, the bottom line here, he advertises he has an advertisement in his store for milkshakes, and he says, milkshakes are one step closer to temperance. So You could go to father and buy a beer, and you could go to son and buy a milkshake if you were on which depending on what side of temperance you were. Okay, now, so here's a picture of Holland in the 1880s, looking west from the old firehouse, which is across the street from the Marriott on A Street. So we're looking west, and you can see the Tower Clock building way back there in the distance. Okay, I got a couple minutes left, and I had some relatives in Friesland, but I wanted to talk about the interurban for a minute because it's so cool. This is a map of the interurban, which came to be in the early 1900s. So it was an basically electric train, and it went all the way from Grand Rapids, ended up at where the Welsh Auditorium is today. And that pedestrian bridge was the actual interurban bridge. It ended up in Grand Rapids. It came through Granville and went through Friesland, which is where my relatives lived, and then went through Zeeland, and then to Holland, and then it branched off from Holland, went down to Saugatuck, and one branch went out along the lake shore, and then along south side of Black Lake, and then another branch went to Saugatuck. So here's the branch that went to Saugatuck. Now here's what it looked like, the interurban. Now I wanted to show some pictures of the interurban and what it would have looked like to my grandparents, my great-grandparents, if they took the interurban from Friesland, because it went right by their property in Friesland to Zeeland and to Holland. So I have some pictures I wanted to show you. So here's a picture of the corner of Fairview Road and Main Street in Zeeland, where Mead Johnson is today. This is the Phoenix Cheese Company. Now, it used to be it was the Zeeland Cheese Company at the time, and it was started by a guy named Siki Brouwer. So they would have seen that. And then coming up to Zeeland, they would have seen, you can see the interurban in the distance, this red brick building on the corner. On the right-hand side, you see there, that actually was a bank. There were actually two banks in downtown Zeeland at the time. First, Den Herder's Bank, and then this commercial bank. Here's going west. Here's De Kruijf's drugstore, and then right next to it, De Kruijf's farm implement store. They would have seen that. And this is going further down Main Street. You would have seen Den Herder's bank. The building in the middle there was Den Herder's Bank before it was on the corner of Main and Elm. Here's Siki Brouwer's bar. So he had a bar and the Zeeland Cheese Company. Here's a picture of the interurban going past the Vinneklassens. The Vinneklassen house is still still stands between New Groningen and Zeeland. This is the bridge for the interurban over the river there. This is what Vinneklassen's place looked like. Interestingly, this picture was drawn by a hobo who came to the Vinneklassens asking for food. So that's quite a good picture of the Vinneklassen brick factory and home before they built the brick house. Here's the brick house. Here's the interurban if they would have taken it to Holland. This is the Holland Hotel. So this is the hotel that existed before the Warm Friend. So this is the Holland Hotel, which was there and before this was torn down to build the Warm Friend Hotel. So that's what they would have seen.
Is that pronounced Boone or Bone?
I say Boone, but I don't know. I mean, I could be wrong. Fred Boone was a had a livery, livery. That was what his. So, and interesting, so the interurban and a livery stable, which obviously with the interurban, there's less need for the livery stable. And then when the automobile came on, there was obviously less need for the interurban. So anyway, so that's, I want to leave the last 15 minutes for any questions you have. So that's kind of a quick tour of some of the first business leaders of Holland. Do you have any questions or comments?
If you have questions, could you raise your hand for me? John?
And aside this slip past Badnos, when it's comment about Badnos arrival.
Yes, I will. So I will talk about Padness for a second. So very interesting story. So we'll touch on it. So the Boones lend or rent horse and wagon to Padness and help him, and that's how kind of he gets started. But anyway, so the Padness story is very interesting. He leaves Russia for America in 1901 when he's 11 years old. The deal is, in Russia, so his family was Jewish, and at the time, if he wasn't going to convert to Christianity, he'd have to serve in the military. His father didn't want him to serve in the military, so he told him to go. So he left, and on his way, he ended up in the Netherlands, and that's where he learned Dutch. And then he took a boat across. He ended up in Ellis Island. He got off at Ellis Island. He didn't have papers or anything, but apparently he got through because he intermingled with another Jewish family. He worked for a railroad, which took him to Iowa. He then looks up an older sister in Chicago, and he lets her hold his money, which he had accumulated from working. Unfortunately, she spends it. So when he gets back from his other jobs, she finds out he doesn't have any money. So he has to make money again. So he gets a job with a furniture merchant. And when the furniture merchant discovers that he can speak Dutch, he says, you should check out this place in West Michigan because there's a colony up there and maybe there's some business. So he takes a boat to Holland. He lands first at Makatawa, and he sees a sign, no Jews allowed. And he meets another guy, Dutch guy, and he says, you gotta get back on the boat. So he gets back on the boat. So he ends up taking the boat then gets off at Holland, and he's wandering around Holland, and he runs into Ben Van Raalte, who's Albertus Van Raalte's son. Ben's businessman. He owns some property in town, and he rents some of that rents to Padness, which was pretty cool because back in those days that was not a popular thing to do. So he rents to Padness, and Louis Padness opens a store, and he starts taking things in trade, and then he starts going around with this horse and buggy that he rents from the Boones, and he starts traveling to farms and so on, and he starts selling things and discovers, people don't have much cash, but they're willing to trade him something. So then he starts this trade, and that's kind of how and that's how it started, and then it evolves into a, big recycling operation. So during the Depression, he's got cash from his business, and so he buys more property downtown. So that's kind of where. And he ends up buying a property that the West Michigan Furniture Factory was on, that I showed you earlier. So really cool story.
So we have a question from Zoom that they put in the chat. They ask, how did they communicate with the Indians when they first came?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I think that was obviously the Dutch couldn't communicate with the Indians directly, but they would communicate with Smith via Smith. So George Smith, the missionary, would be how they would initially communicate with them. But yeah, that was very difficult. And of course, they were two very different cultures, didn't understand each other. So you probably know some of heard some of these stories. So the Indians, the Native American, the Ottawa would spend their summers up in Leelanau. They'd come down here in the winter. So so the Dutch arrived in the winter when the Ottawa here. The Ottawa go up to Leelanau in the spring, even though they're not supposed to do that because the government wants them to stay here and farm, right? But they don't want to give up their ways, so they go up to Leelanau. Well, the Dutch think they've left for good, and the Dutch are starving, so they basically raid their field, their gardens, and their animals. They take their wood and and use it for their own stuff. And then when the Ottawa come back the next winter, they're like, "What happened to all our stuff?" Right? So then there was obviously a lot of animosity between the Dutch and the Ottawa. So the Ottawa, they had some internal conflicts because they couldn't decide whether they liked Smith or the Catholic missionary. And then they eventually decide to move. And so they basically go back up to Leelanau, and they do end up staying there. Before they left, they sold land to people like Van Putten and Capon and Dikema, Weeby Dikema. There's a Dikema Street by Hines. The Dikema family owned that. One of the famous lawyers in Holland was politician lawyers. Was named Dikema. That was the son of that family. So anyway, I hope that answers that question a little bit.
So we have another Zoom question. They ask, did Zeeland experience major loss from the 1871 fire?
Oh, to my knowledge, the fire did not get to Zeeland. So I don't think they did experience loss. I will say that Zeeland lost a number of people to Grand Rapids when they first arrived. Vandeleister financed the trip we got here, and he financed Cornelius Vandermolen's congregation. And Jan Stigety was part of that group, and the Stigetys left to Grand Rapids because they couldn't figure out how to live here, make a living. So they went to Grand Rapids, and Vandermolen took a church in Grand Rapids as well. So it's kind of interesting that some of the early families that came here, they came to Zeeland actually left because it was really hard. They didn't have money, didn't have food, couldn't make a living, so they decided to go to Grand Rapids, which was booming. And the tension was, my ancestors are the same way. They were very leery of moving to big cities. They really they didn't want their children corrupted by the evils of the big city. So it was a very tough decision to leave a safe place and go to a city. Yeah.
Steve, I have a question. I don't know how many more chat questions you have. You don't have any more. My understanding is when Van Ralde came to this country, that he had, of course, his original designs were on going to the west shore of Lake Michigan, Wisconsin, I assume.
Yeah.
And that he brought his followers to a certain point, whether it be Detroit or Allegan, and then decided to take 6, 7, or 8 of them with him to this area, scouted the area, and that's when he made a decision to stay here instead of checking out Wisconsin.
Yeah. Yeah, so he did. So he took his group to Detroit, and it was winter when he got to Detroit. So I think the lake was frozen, so he wasn't going to go around. So he left them in Detroit, and then he went to Kalamazoo and then to Allegan, and he met Judge Kellogg there. And then he did come up with, actually, I think he came by himself with Harrington brought him up here and to the Old Wing Mission. And then Smith and Van Ralde scouted the area. And then they sent word back for the other folks to come. And then they came up to Old Wing Mission and stayed with the Smiths, and then built some shacks on the corner of 8th and Waverly, which was where the Vanderhaar farm ended up being. So they lived some shacks. That's where they went next. And then, but then of course they came, and obviously shortly thereafter, all these other groups from different parts of the Netherlands were coming as well.
And my understanding is that the Indians were here maybe 2 years after Van Ralde arrived. Is
About
that-
2 years.
And during that time, they were of tremendous help to the Dutch.
Yeah.
For example, my understanding is that the Dutch, because they came from a flat land, weren't familiar with trees, that the Indians had to teach them how to cut down the trees.
Yeah.
Okay.
They had to teach them how to, they had to teach them how to, they did teach them how to cut down the trees. And in one, story from the Jan Siggety's son was they actually helped them build a house. And then there's another story, which I can't find any more information on, but when Van der Leister and Stegety, when they came to Holland, they ended up at the Waterhouse, which was on the present where the Holland Country Club used to be, that property in that swamp area there on the river. When they were there, they met an African-American who helped them, who taught them how to cut trees as well. Now, I don't know if there's a connection here, but I just remember reading recently that there was a underground railroad that was that had a depot in Ferrisburg. There's an African-American up there. Somebody just, that was in the paper this year. And I'm kind of wondering if that African-American they met was going to that place in Ferrisburg. So that person helped them learn how to cut wood too. So, yeah.
John?
I've got a Padnos story. I played tennis with Stu Padnos,
Okay.
who played tennis well into his 80s,
Yeah.
which doesn't seem so surprising to me now. But anyway, he actually built a tennis court on his property on South Shore Drive. But he was, I told my wife he's the best, the nicest millionaire I know.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. He was, Louis was, we'll get to this. The story will be in the Sentinel in a few weeks about Louis Padnos and Cornelius Blom, but apparently Louis was quite the card player. So they would play cards at night at the fire station. So he was quite gregarious. Louis Padnos was. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. We're about 2 minutes left. You see anything on chat, David? Anybody got anything here they might want to ask? Well, good. Thank you very much, Steve. It was very enlightening. And I think we all love talking about the history of Holland. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. There'll be more in the Sentinel, so just keep your eyes there. All right.